It was the early 1800s, in the rural hills of Tennessee, when John Bell and his family moved to a plot of land near the Red River. Little did they know, they were about to become the victims of one of the most terrifying supernatural events in American history. The Bell family would soon face a curse that would haunt them for years, sending shivers down the spines of those who would later hear their tale. The Bell family consisted of John, his wife Lucy, and their children, 2 sons and 3 daughters. Life on their farm began like any other pioneer families. Hard work, modest living, and the serenity of nature. But things started to change shortly after they arrived at their new home. At first, the occurrences were subtle, almost unnoticeable. Strange noises in the night, knocking on the doors, whispers in the dark, and objects moving around without explanation. The family shrugged it off, attributing the noises to the wind, animals, or perhaps an overactive imagination. But things quickly escalated. One evening, after a long day's work, John Bell was sitting on his porch when he heard what he described as a strange knocking sound. It wasn't like anything he had heard before. The sound was rhythmic, almost like a tapping, but there was no source. It echoed through the woods around the house, sending chills down his spine. Curious, he went out into the yard, but found nothing. The strange knocking didn't stop. The Bell family tried to ignore it, but the eerie sounds only grew louder. Soon, the family began to experience strange, inexplicable events. One of the Bell daughters, Betsy, began to suffer from violent fits. She would convulse, scream, and writhe in agony, often reporting that someone was physically attacking her. At first, her parents thought she had some sort of illness or seizure disorder, but the doctors could find no medical explanation for her symptoms. That's when they realized that something far darker was at play. The family tried everything to rid themselves of the unseen force tormenting them. They brought in local preachers, hoping that prayer and religious rituals would drive the spirit away, but nothing worked. Instead, the attacks became more frequent and violent. Objects in the house began to move on their own. Furniture would shift overnight, doors slammed on their own, and heavy rocks appeared on the doorstep, seemingly thrown from an impossible distance. The most terrifying and unexplained occurrences were the voices. The Bell family began to hear a voice that would come from nowhere, low, guttural, and full of malice. The voice would speak to them, taunting them, calling them by name. It identified itself as the witch, the Bell Witch. But why had the family been chosen? Why were they being tormented by this malicious entity? The situation escalated when the Bell Witch began targeting John Bell himself. Late at night, he would experience strange symptoms, numbness, weakness, and a feeling of being choked. His throat would tighten, and he would feel as if something invisible was physically attacking him. Over time, his health deteriorated rapidly. The Bell Witch's hold on him became so strong that he could hardly leave his bed. It was as though the entity had attached itself to him, draining his life force. Rumors began to spread throughout the town of Adams, Tennessee, where the Bell family lived. Neighbors spoke of the strange events at the Bell farm, and people began to fear for their own safety. Local legend has it that the witch's power was so great that it could manipulate not only physical objects but also the very elements. Some claimed to hear her voice on the wind or feel an unnatural chill whenever they passed the Bell farm. But what was even more unsettling was the fact that the Bell Witch seemed to have an inexplicable knowledge of the family's private affairs. She would reveal secrets that no one but the Bell family could know, including hidden feelings, family disputes, and even deep, personal guilt. How did she know these things? Was this an angry spirit or something far darker and more dangerous? The Bell Witch's torment continued for years. It became clear to the family that they could not escape her power. She seemed to have the ability to strike at will, and her malice knew no bounds. Some members of the family, including John Bell, became physically ill, while others suffered mental and emotional anguish. The Bell Witch was determined to make their lives a living hell, and it would take more than prayer or rituals to stop her. But despite the horrors they faced, the Bell family endured. Eventually, after years of torment, John Bell died under mysterious circumstances. Some say it was from poison, others claimed the Bell Witch herself had killed him. His death marked the peak of the witch's reign of terror. But the story didn't end there. The Bell Witch continued to haunt the area for years, even after John's death. The haunting at the Bell farm did not end with John Bell's mysterious death. In fact, it escalated. The death of the family patriarch seemed to give the Bell Witch even more power, and the family members who were left behind soon realized that they could not escape her malevolent presence. After John Bell's death, the witch's torment shifted focus to other members of the Bell family, especially Betsy, the youngest daughter. Betsy had been one of the first victims of the witch's wrath, suffering from violent physical attacks, strange fits, and unexplained bruises. But as the haunting continued, her suffering intensified. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy was found screaming in the middle of the night, her body convulsing as if something was physically attacking her. Her screams were so loud that the neighbors could hear them from a distance. When her family reached her, they found her lying in bed, her hair and body twisted as if an invisible force was trying to pull her out of the bed. "Stop! Please stop!" Betsy cried out, her voice strained with terror. She begged the invisible entity to release her, but it only mocked her. The Bell Witch's voice echoed through the room, its tone cold and taunting. "I will never stop," the voice boomed. "You are mine." As the days passed, Betsy's condition only worsened. She began to have violent outbursts, attacking her family and anyone who came near her. It was as if the Bell Witch had gained full control over her, using Betsy as a vessel for its cruel whims. But the most terrifying part was that Betsy was no longer the only one who could hear the witch's voice. As the supernatural activity intensified, the Bell family began to feel the witch's presence everywhere. It wasn't just the strange noises, the moving objects, or the mysterious footprints that appeared out of nowhere. It was the way the witch seemed to manipulate time and space itself. The Bell family would hear voices in different rooms at the same time, voices that didn't come from the people they knew. Sometimes, the witch would mimic the voices of their loved ones, calling out for help only to reveal herself as something far more sinister. And then came the whispers in the woods. The neighbors and even local travelers passing by the Bell farm began to hear strange murmurs coming from the trees. The whispers were faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but they carried a sense of foreboding, a warning that something terrible was lurking just out of sight. Soon, even the most skeptical people in the area began to believe that the Bell Witch was more than just a ghost or spirit. There were rumors that she had once been a powerful sorceress, cursed by ancient forces, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to cross her path. Some said she had the ability to possess people, making them do things they didn't understand. Others whispered that the Bell Witch wasn't just a spirit, it was a demon, a dark entity from beyond the grave, intent on causing as much pain as possible. But the most chilling detail of all was the Bell Witch's apparent obsession with Betsy. The witch began to target her more directly, claiming her as her own. Betsy's behavior became more erratic. Sometimes she would be found talking to the walls, her eyes blank and unfocused, as if she was conversing with someone no one else could see. On other occasions, she would wake up in the middle of the night, her face contorted in terror as she screamed in a language no one understood. Her words were garbled, but there was an unmistakable sense of fear in her voice. At times, Betsy would wake up in the morning with bruises and scratches covering her arms and legs as though she had been physically attacked in the night. And yet, no one had been in her room. The doors and windows were locked. The family members who slept near her heard nothing. As the witch's grip on Betsy grew stronger, the family began to fear for her life. The once bright and lively girl now appeared hollow, drained of all energy. It was as if the Bell Witch was slowly consuming her from the inside, using her as a pawn in a game much larger than anyone could comprehend. By the time summer came, the Bell family had reached the brink of desperation. The haunting had become so intense that they couldn't go a single night without hearing the witch's voice, her cruel taunts echoing through the house. The Bell family reached out to the local clergy, asking for help, hoping that some form of exorcism or spiritual intervention might break the curse that had taken hold of their lives. In response, the Reverend James P. Finley, a well-respected preacher in the area, came to the Bell farm. He had heard about the strange happenings, and though skeptical at first, he agreed to visit the house and perform an exorcism. His arrival was met with a sense of anticipation, perhaps, finally, someone with the power to rid the family of their torment. But as soon as Reverend Finley entered the Bell house, he experienced the witch's wrath firsthand. The moment he stepped inside, a loud, terrifying scream filled the air, and all of the windows in the house shattered at once. The Bell Witch's voice grew louder, and she began to speak directly to the Reverend. "You think you can banish me?" The witch taunted. "You think your prayers will stop me?" "I will never leave." The Reverend was shaken, but he pressed on, reciting prayers and demanding that the witch reveal herself. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the witch would relent. But then, in a flash of intense energy, the house shook violently, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Reverend Finley fell to his knees, overcome by the sheer power of the presence in the room. He could feel the air grow thick and oppressive, as if the witch was trying to suffocate him. After that night, Reverend Finley left the Bell house, his faith shaken to its core. He could offer no explanation for the terrifying events he had witnessed, and he admitted that the Bell Witch was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The haunting had only intensified, and the Bell family was no closer to understanding what had caused the evil that now inhabited their home. They were caught in a desperate struggle between good and evil, with no end in sight. As the months passed, the Bell family's hope for an end to the haunting slowly faded. The once vibrant and lively home had turned into a house of horrors, a place where no one felt safe. The Bell Witch's power had grown, feeding on their fear and leaving them in a constant state of dread. No one in the family could escape her wrath, not even the youngest members. Betsy Bell, once a cheerful and innocent girl, had become a shell of her former self. Her body was covered in bruises and cuts that appeared mysteriously in the middle of the night. She had become physically weak, and her mind, once sharp and curious, was slipping away, consumed by the force that tormented her. She spent hours staring blankly at the walls, speaking in a language no one understood. Her eyes glazed over in a trance-like state. The family tried everything they could to save her. Prayers, rituals, and even appeals to local spiritual leaders, but nothing seemed to work. One night, as the family gathered around the fire in the living room, a chilling presence filled the room. The temperature in the house plummeted. The air became thick and heavy, suffocating them. And then, the voice of the Bell Witch, as clear as day, echoed through the room. "She is mine now," the witch whispered, its voice low and guttural. "Her soul belongs to me." Betsy's eyes snapped open, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. She fell to the ground, writhing in agony as if something was trying to tear her apart from the inside. Her family rushed to her side, but their efforts to comfort her only seemed to make things worse. Her body contorted unnaturally, her back arching as though she was being pulled by invisible hands. The voice of the Bell Witch mocked her, laughing cruelly at the family's helplessness. "You cannot save her," the voice taunted. "She will be my vessel, and I will consume her soul." The Bell family watched in horror as their daughter struggled, trapped in a battle they didn't understand. What had they done to deserve this curse? How had they become the target of such malevolent power? Every day, they hoped for relief, but with each passing hour, the situation grew darker, more hopeless. But things were about to take an even darker turn. The arrival of the stranger. One evening, after a particularly violent episode with Betsy, the Bell family was visited by a stranger. He was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, dressed in tattered clothing. His presence was unsettling, and he seemed to have an unnerving knowledge of the family's plight. The stranger claimed to be a traveler, seeking refuge from the harsh winter. He arrived at the Bell farm, asking for food and shelter, and though the family was wary, they let him in. He seemed kind enough, but there was something strange about him. He didn't speak much, but his eyes never left Betsy. That night, after the family had gone to bed, they awoke to the sound of muffled voices. When they went to check on Betsy, they found her sitting in a corner of her room, speaking in a language no one could understand. The stranger was there, standing silently by her side, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down their spines. "She will be mine too," the stranger whispered, his voice almost hypnotic. The family tried to intervene, but before they could act, the stranger vanished into the night, leaving them with nothing but the unsettling feeling that something sinister had just transpired. Betsy's condition worsened after that night, her fits becoming more violent, her health deteriorating rapidly. As days turned into weeks, the Bell Witch seemed to have more control over Betsy than ever before. Her once bright spirit had been replaced by a hollow shell, and the Bell Witch's voice was no longer a mere whisper, it was everywhere, all the time. The family could hear it in the wind, in the trees, in the very walls of their home. Betsy would wake up screaming in terror, claiming that she saw shadows watching her through the windows, shapes that moved in the corners of the room, always just out of reach. She would beg for help, calling out for her parents, but when they tried to comfort her, her eyes would empty as if a different force had taken control of her. The family was at a breaking point. They had tried everything they could, from spiritual intervention to physical isolation, but nothing seemed to stop the witch's hold. The strange attacks on the family continued, with objects flying across the room, voices echoing through the walls, and unexplained physical wounds appearing on the family members. The witch's promise. One of the most terrifying incidents occurred when the Bell family's last hope, another exorcism, was performed in a last-ditch effort to free Betsy from the Bell Witch's grasp. The Reverend James Finley, who had witnessed the witch's power before, returned to the Bell farm, determined to banish the demon once and for all. He led the family in prayer, trying to force the witch to reveal itself. For a moment, it seemed as though the witch might relent. The air grew still, and the house fell silent. But then, the voice of the Bell Witch rang out louder than ever. "You think you can banish me?" the witch screamed. "You cannot. I have been here for centuries. I will never leave this place." Suddenly, the room filled with a powerful, bone-chilling cold. The walls of the house began to crack and groan as if the very foundation was being ripped apart. Reverend Finley collapsed to the ground, unable to continue the ritual, his face pale with terror. The Bell Witch's laughter filled the room, and the voices of the Bell family members were drowned out by the cacophony. The witch had made its final promise. "You will all be mine," the voice boomed. "And when you are gone, this farm will remain forever cursed." The curse of the Bell Witch had deepened, and the terror only continued to grow. With each passing day, the witch's power strengthened, and the Bell family was pushed closer to the edge. No one in the town of Adams could explain the bizarre and terrifying events that were taking place on the Bell farm. And no one knew how to stop it. As the story of the Bell Witch spread, more people came to visit the farm, some out of curiosity, others hoping to witness the curse firsthand. Some said the witch was simply a spirit, others believed it was a demon, but no one knew for sure. What was clear was that whatever it was not finished. The Bell family's nightmare was far from over. As the days stretched on, the Bell family found themselves in the grips of an unimaginable nightmare. The presence of the Bell Witch seemed to seep into every corner of their lives, infecting their thoughts and actions. No one in the family was spared from the torment. Every room in their home seemed to be haunted, every moment filled with dread. Betsy's condition worsened, and she became even more unrecognizable from the girl she once was. The strange language that the witch had her speak was growing stronger, more pronounced, as if the witch was trying to force Betsy into complete submission. No longer just a victim of the witch's physical attacks, Betsy seemed to be spiritually connected to the entity, her very soul was being consumed by it. Her screams echoed throughout the house, and when the family tried to comfort her, they could feel the unnatural cold in the air, the presence of the Bell Witch pressing down on them, as if the witch was watching, judging, waiting for her next move. The once lively girl who had laughed and played with her siblings was now a broken shell, a puppet to an unseen hand. Then, one night, as the witch's attacks reached a fever pitch, the family made a desperate decision. They would leave their home, take Betsy, and flee the land they had once called home. It was the only option left. The Bell Witch's presence was suffocating, its reach inescapable. But before they could even pack their things, the witch struck again, this time with an unimaginable force. The shocking revelation. The family was in the living room, sitting together, when the air suddenly grew thick. The temperature plummeted and their breath became visible in the frigid room. It was the witch's signature, always a precursor to something horrifying. Suddenly, the voice of the witch rang out clearer than ever before, as if it was all around them, surrounding them. "Leave if you wish. But remember this, no one will ever escape me. You belong to me now." Betsy, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, stood up slowly. Her eyes were vacant, glazed over, as if she was no longer there. The witch had taken complete control. As she walked toward her family, they could see her lips moving, but it was not her voice that came out. "I will never let you go." In an instant, Betsy collapsed to the ground, screaming as though she were being ripped apart from the inside. The Bell Witch's power over her had reached its peak. Her body twisted violently, contorting in ways that seemed impossible. It was as though someone was inside her, controlling her every movement, forcing her to do their bidding. John and Lucy Bell rushed to Betsy's side, but they were stopped short by an invisible force. It felt like a wall of air had been thrown up between them and their daughter. No matter how much they tried to reach out to her, they couldn't get past it. The force was too strong. The witch's laughter echoed through the house, cruel and mocking. It was everywhere, inside their minds, inside their hearts. Betsy screamed, but the scream was not hers. It was the voice of the Bell Witch itself, powerful and relentless. The witch had taken complete control, and nothing the family did could stop it. It was at that moment that a terrifying truth came to light. The Bell Witch had not just cursed the family. It had cursed the land itself. No one could escape. Not even death. The final assault. The next morning, as the family tried to come to grips with what had transpired, they noticed something strange in the house. The walls were changing. The very structure of the home seemed to be warping. The doors creaked and groaned as if the house itself was alive. Shadows moved across the floor, flickering in the corners of the rooms. And most chilling of all, the faces of the family members began to blur, distorted by the witch's power, as if they were no longer entirely themselves. But the worst part was the relentless attacks on John Bell. His health, which had already been deteriorating from the witch's influence, worsened rapidly. He had grown weak, pale, and feverish, as though something was draining the life out of him. He could barely speak, his voice barely a whisper. Each night, as the witch's presence grew stronger, his body seemed to lose more and more vitality. One night, as John lay in bed, struggling to breathe, he heard the voice of the Bell Witch once again. This time, the voice was calm, almost tender. "It is time for you to leave this world, John Bell. You have served your purpose." John tried to speak, to cry out for help, but his body failed him. His eyes fluttered open and closed, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The voice of the witch was the last thing he would ever hear. In the early hours of the morning, John Bell died, his cause of death a mystery to everyone but the witch itself. His body was cold, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as though locked in a final gaze with something no one could see. The Bell family, devastated by the loss of their patriarch, was now left to face the full force of the curse. The witch had taken everything from them, everything they loved, everything they knew. And as they stood in the silent house, staring at John's lifeless body, they understood one thing: they could never escape. The Bell Witch had won. The witch's final threat. In the days that followed, the Bell Witch grew bolder, her attacks more relentless. She seemed to be everywhere, whispering in the wind, mocking the family with cruel laughter, and even appearing in physical form at times. But it was in the final moments of the Bell Witch's reign that the true horror came to light. Just before Betsy was finally taken, she screamed one last time. Her body trembled violently, her eyes locked on her parents as she whispered, "I will never be free." The Bell Witch had claimed her, just as it had claimed her father. The curse was complete. No one would ever escape it. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the Bell Witch disappeared. The house fell silent. The haunting was over, or so they thought. The days following John Bell's death were filled with mourning, but the Bell family couldn't escape the shadows that clung to their lives. The death of their patriarch seemed to mark a turning point. Though the physical manifestations of the Bell Witch's attacks had subsided, the curse was far from over. The haunting did not end with John's death. In fact, it only grew stronger, more sinister. The Bell family attempted to carry on with their lives, but the burden of the witch's presence was always there, lurking in the corners of their minds, hanging over them like a dark cloud. The family tried to rebuild after the loss, but it was clear that they were all haunted emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. No one was truly free. Betsy, the youngest of the Bell children, was left a shell of her former self. Though she was no longer under the witch's direct physical control, her mind remained scarred by the horrific experiences she had endured. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the cold grip of the Bell Witch whenever she closed her eyes. And worse yet, there were still signs that the witch was not done with her. Betsy often spoke of seeing the witch's apparition, an eerie, shadowy figure that would appear in the corners of her room, watching her, waiting. The family began to believe that the witch's presence was no longer bound to the land. It had become a lingering, ethereal force, lingering in the minds of those it had tormented. It was clear that Betsy's connection to the witch was far more than just a physical one. It was as though the Bell Witch had embedded itself within her, a part of her very soul. But the most chilling detail came when the family began to hear strange occurrences once again. The reappearance of the witch's voice. Several months after John's death, the Bell family began to hear the voice of the Bell Witch once again. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the wind, a rustling of the leaves. But over time it grew louder. It spoke to them in the same menacing, mocking tone as before, as if it had never left. "You cannot escape me," the voice would taunt. "I am in your blood. I will never leave." The family tried to ignore the sounds, hoping that they were merely the figments of their imagination, the result of a mind overwhelmed by grief and fear. But deep down, they knew the truth. The Bell Witch was still here, still controlling their lives, still tormenting them in ways they could not comprehend. One evening, as Lucy Bell sat alone in the parlor, she heard the voice again. It was louder this time, and it seemed to come from every corner of the room. "You think I am gone?" the voice said, its tone cold and mocking. "I never left. You belong to me now." Lucy jumped up, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked around the room, but there was no one there. The house was silent, too silent. She called out for her children, but no one answered. The witch had invaded her thoughts once again, and she could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on her chest. The lasting legacy of the Bell Witch. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread throughout the town of Adams about the Bell family's misfortunes. The Bell Witch had become something of a local legend, with people from all over the region traveling to the farm to catch a glimpse of the mysterious force that had taken hold of the Bell family. Some said the farm was cursed, others whispered that the Bell Witch was still active, searching for its next victim. But the Bell family was not the only one to suffer from the witch's wrath. In the years that followed, several people who came into contact with the Bell family or visited the farm reported strange occurrences of their own. Visitors to the Bell farm would hear strange noises, whispers in the wind, footsteps in the woods, but most chilling of all were the sightings of a shadowy figure lurking in the trees, watching from a distance. Some of these visitors claimed to have seen a strange apparition near the Bell farm. A figure, tall, dark, and formless, would appear in the distance, moving toward the house with an eerie, almost otherworldly presence. Those who came too close were often struck by an overwhelming sense of fear and dread, with some even falling ill, suffering from nightmares, or losing their sense of time and reality. It was as though the Bell Witch had marked them, claiming them as part of its twisted legacy. The Bell family itself could never find peace. Betsy, still haunted by the witch, eventually moved away, but the scars of the haunting never left her. She went on to marry and have children, but the witch's influence remained, always just beneath the surface. She would never forget the torment she had endured as a child. In the years that followed, the Bell Witch became an enduring part of American folklore. But for the Bell family, it was more than just a legend. It was their lived reality. They had experienced the true horror of an unrelenting, malevolent force, and they could never escape its reach. The Bell Witch is said to have vanished for a time, but its legacy lived on in the land surrounding the Bell farm. The farm itself was eventually abandoned, but the haunting continued to loom over the town of Adams, where stories of the Bell Witch were told around campfires and whispered in hushed tones. Some say the witch still lingers in the area, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim to cross its path. And for those brave enough or foolish enough to venture near the old Bell farm, the ghostly presence of the Bell Witch may still be felt. For some, it remains a reminder of the past, a haunting story passed down through generations. For others, it's a warning: the Bell Witch may never truly be gone. The curse continues. The Bell Witch's tale is not just a story. It is an enduring mystery, a chilling reminder of the unknown forces that may exist just beyond our understanding. The Bell family's suffering, their desperate attempts to escape the witch's grasp, and the strange phenomena that occurred in the wake of their torment have made the Bell Witch haunting one of the most terrifying and inexplicable mysteries in American history. Whether it was a powerful spirit, a demonic force, or something even darker, the Bell Witch's curse remains unresolved. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part of all. It had been decades since the Bell Witch had first tormented the Bell family, and the farm where it all began had long been abandoned. The once bustling homestead now stood as a crumbling monument to the horrors that had transpired there. The stories had faded into legend, passed down through generations, becoming the stuff of ghostly folklore. But as time passed, the Bell Witch seemed to fade into the annals of history, or so the townspeople thought. It wasn't until 1965 that the witch's dark influence began to stir again, this time in a way that no one expected. A new family had moved to Adams, Tennessee, seeking a quiet life away from the city. The Thompson family, Jack, his wife Evelyn, and their two children, Kathy and Ben, had heard the local legends about the Bell Witch, but they dismissed them as nothing more than ghost stories. They were eager to make their new home on the land, unaware of the dark history that had once plagued it. At first, the Thompsons noticed nothing unusual. The house was old and weathered, but nothing seemed out of place. However, after a few weeks, the family began to experience strange occurrences. It started with odd noises, scratching sounds in the walls, tapping on the windows at night, but the family thought little of it. They assumed it was the house settling or perhaps the local wildlife. But then the voices began. It was Kathy, the youngest of the Thompson children, who first heard them. At night, She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she began to hear faint whispers coming from the corner of her room. She told her parents, but they brushed it off as a figment of her imagination. After all, she was just a little girl, and children often had vivid dreams or heard things that weren't there. However, as the days passed, the voices grew louder. They no longer whispered, they spoke clearly, and the words they spoke were chilling. "Get out." At first, Kathy thought it was a prank. Maybe one of her friends or her brother Ben playing tricks on her. But when she asked them about it, they both denied having anything to do with the voices. The whispers grew more urgent, more demanding. "You don't belong here. Leave, before it's too late." Kathy became afraid to sleep, but her parents still didn't believe her. They chalked it up to her being scared of the old house. But it wasn't long before Evelyn, Kathy's mother, began to hear the voices too. One evening, as she was doing dishes in the kitchen, she heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper behind her. "You're not welcome here." Evelyn froze, the dish in her hand trembling as she turned around. But no one was there. The house was empty. Jack was outside tending to the garden, and the children were playing in the yard. She shrugged it off, but that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The reawakening of the witch. Over the following weeks, the Thompson family's experience became even more terrifying. Kathy's dreams grew worse, filled with strange visions of a dark figure watching her from the shadows. At times, she would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, gasping for air, her heart pounding. She would scream, but the screams seemed to echo in the night, as if absorbed by the house itself. But the most terrifying part was the sudden onset of illness that struck the family. Jack began to feel weak and fatigued, and Evelyn developed severe headaches that kept her bedridden for days at a time. Kathy and Ben both became irritable, snapping at each other without reason. The once warm and inviting house now felt cold and oppressive. The air was thick with a sense of dread. One night, as Evelyn lay awake in bed, she heard something that froze her in place. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate, coming from the hallway. She called out for Jack, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped just outside their bedroom door, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, in a voice that chilled her to the core, a familiar voice spoke. "I told you to leave." Evelyn's blood ran cold as she realized the voice was not her husband's. It was the same voice she had heard in the house before, the same voice that had tormented Kathy, the bell which had returned, the family's desperation. Terrified, Evelyn woke Jack, and together they checked the house from top to bottom. There was no one there. The doors were locked and all the windows were secure. But the presence, the heavy, suffocating presence, was undeniable. As the days passed, the Thompsons became more and more desperate. They tried to contact the authorities, but no one would believe them. The witch was not just a ghost. It was an unseen force, a presence that could not be explained by logic or reason. The witch's attacks grew bolder, and it began to target Jack more directly. One evening, as he sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, he felt something cold brush against his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing there. A few moments later, his chair was knocked over, sending him crashing to the floor. His body was bruised, his arms and legs aching as if something had physically assaulted him. But when he looked for signs of the attack, there was nothing. No marks, no blood, just the lingering feeling of being hunted. The Thompsons became convinced that the bell which had returned to claim them. They were no longer just random victims of a haunted house. They were part of a much darker legacy. The bell which had marked them, just as it had marked the Bell family before them. Desperate, they turned to local historians and paranormal experts, hoping for an answer. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. The bell which was not just a ghost. It was a curse, an ancient force bound to the land. According to the legends, the witch had been a powerful spirit, one that had been cast out of the human world and bound to the Bell family's farm. But what the Thompsons had discovered was even more unsettling. The witch's power could not be contained by death, could not be exorcised, only endured. The witch had not only tormented the Bell family, It had claimed the land itself, trapping any who came into contact with it. The curse was not bound to the house, but to the very earth beneath it. The final confrontation. In a final act of desperation, the Thompsons attempted to leave the farm, hoping to escape the curse. But as they packed their belongings, the witch's power grew to a terrifying level. The windows shattered as if struck by invisible hands, and the doors slammed open and shut violently. The air became thick with an unholy pressure, and the whispers grew louder. "You cannot leave," the witch's voice bellowed. "You belong here now, forever." The Thompsons knew they could never escape. The bell which had claimed them, just as it had claimed the bells before them. It would continue to haunt the land, its curse an eternal blight on the land and anyone who dared to settle there. The last words of the bell which echoed through the night, leaving behind only silence and fear. The family vanished without a trace, their legacy now intertwined with that of the Bell Witch. The years passed, and the land once owned by the Bell family remained abandoned. The farmhouse, long forgotten, was consumed by the surrounding woods. Nature had reclaimed the land, until, decades later, another family would unknowingly step onto the cursed soil, setting in motion a terrifying chain of events. It was in 1985 when the Lawrence family, a young couple with 2 children, moved to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of the city. Seeking peace and tranquility, they bought a small piece of property on the outskirts of town, unaware that they were moving into the shadow of the Bell Witch's curse. The house was old but charming, and the land was cheap, too cheap to resist. First, things seemed perfect. The family was content, settling into their new home. They worked the land, raised animals, and enjoyed the simplicity of rural life. However, just a few months after they moved in, strange things began to happen. It started with the usual eerie sensations, objects shifting in the night, whispers on the wind, but as time went on, the phenomenon intensified. One night, after hearing strange scratching noises in the walls, Jim Lawrence, the father, went outside to investigate. He heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the property. When he turned to confront whatever was out there, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. A cold chill swept over him, and he froze, his blood running cold. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure dark, formless, and tall, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. The figure didn't move, it simply watched him. Jim felt a sense of dread wash over him, and without thinking, he rushed back inside. He slammed the door behind him, his heart racing, but the coldness that filled the room stayed with him. The whispers began again, and this time, they were not whispers at all. They were voices, clear and unmistakable. "Leave this place. You do not belong here." Jim tried to calm himself, telling himself it was the wind or his mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something about the house and the land felt wrong. The children's nightmare. It wasn't long before the children began to notice the strange occurrences. Young Sarah Lawrence, the youngest of the children, started having vivid nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming in terror, and run to her parents' room claiming that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. The thing was, her parents could never find anyone. But Sarah's description of the figure was always the same, a tall, dark shape with glowing eyes, watching her from the shadows. Her older brother, Michael, wasn't immune to the supernatural events either. He often spoke of hearing voices calling his name in the dead of night, but when he went to investigate, he found nothing. Objects would move from place to place, books off shelves, chairs pushed out from the dining table, windows opening on their own. Every night, the family would hear footsteps echoing down the hall, but when they looked, no one was there. But it was when Sarah went missing that things took a darker turn. Sarah's disappearance. One evening after dinner, Sarah went outside to play in the yard. It was just a simple game of hide-and-seek, but when it was time for dinner, she didn't come back. The Lawrence family called for her, but there was no response. They searched the yard, calling her name, but she had vanished. The woods surrounding the house seemed to swallow her whole. The family's frantic search lasted for hours, but there was no sign of Sarah. They called the authorities, but by the time the search began, it was too late. The sun had set, and the darkness of the woods was thick with an unnerving silence. When the police arrived, they scoured the land for days, but there was no trace of Sarah. Not a footprint, not a sound. Days turned into weeks, and the search turned up nothing. No one could explain how a young child could vanish without a trace in such a short amount of time. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The Lawrence family was left devastated, their grief compounded by the terrifying feeling that something was responsible for her disappearance. They began to believe that the Bell Witch had returned and that it had claimed their daughter just as it had claimed the Bell family before them. The investigation into the curse. Desperate, the Lawrences turned to local historians and experts in the paranormal. They had heard the old stories of the Bell Witch, and now they had experienced the terror firsthand. One of the experts, an older man named Samuel Carter, had researched the Bell Witch for years. He had studied the strange history of the Bell family and the supernatural events that had plagued them. Carter had heard the rumors about the curse, but he never fully believed it until now. Carter came to the Lawrence farm hoping to uncover the truth behind Sarah's disappearance. He walked the land, inspecting every inch of the property. As he stood in front of the old Bell farmhouse, the air seemed to shift, and Carter felt a sudden chill run down his spine. It was as if the land itself was alive, watching him. That's when he saw it, the same dark figure that Jim Lawrence had described standing just at the edge of the trees. But this time, Carter could see the figure clearly. It was tall, shadowy, and formless, its glowing eyes locked onto him. The figure didn't move. It simply watched. The Bell Witch never left, the voice echoed in Carter's mind. He knew at that moment that the curse was real. The Bell Witch had not only tormented the Bell family but had laid claim to the land itself. It was waiting, watching for the next family to come and claim the farm. And now it had taken Sarah. Carter's investigation revealed something even more chilling. The Bell Witch wasn't just bound to the Bell family or the farm, it was a malevolent force, an entity tied to the land. Its power growing stronger with each new family that came to settle on the cursed soil. The witch's revenge. In a final act of desperation, the Lawrence family attempted to leave the land. They packed their things, ready to abandon the home and run, but the Bell Witch wouldn't let them go. The moment they attempted to leave, the house shook violently. Windows shattered. Doors slammed shut. The walls seemed to close in on them. The family heard Sarah's voice, distorted and hollow, calling to them from the woods. "You can't escape. You belong to me now." The Lawrence family realized they were trapped. The Bell Witch had claimed them just as it had claimed the Bell family generations ago. They could never leave the land. The curse would follow them forever. The Lawrence family had no idea what they were up against. They had thought they could escape, thinking that simply leaving would break the curse. But the Bell Witch had other plans. As the family stood in the midst of the chaos, doors slamming, windows shattering, Sarah's voice echoing through the trees, there was no doubt left in their minds. They could not escape the curse. They were forever bound to the land that had once belonged to the Bell family. That night, as the family sat huddled together in the living room, the air around them grew heavier. It felt as though the very walls of the house were closing in on them. The temperature dropped to freezing, and their breaths formed clouds in the icy air. And then the witch's voice boomed in their minds as if it were coming from every direction at once. "You cannot leave." The voice was no longer a whisper, it was powerful, commanding, and full of rage. The witch's power had reached its peak. It had claimed the land, and now it was claiming them, one by one. The walls trembled, and suddenly the room went dark. The only sound was the harsh beating of their hearts, pounding in unison with the suffocating silence that filled the house. In the dark, they could hear movement, footsteps. But they weren't their own. They were the sound of something or someone drawing closer. Jack Lawrence, trying to hold onto his courage, shouted, "Leave us alone. We don't belong to you." But his voice only fueled the witch's wrath. The house shook violently and the temperature dropped even further. In a flash, a figure materialized in the center of the room, cloaked in shadows. The air grew thick and the smell of decay and rot filled their nostrils. It was her, the Bell Witch. Her form was an unsettling mix of shadow and human-like features. She stood tall, her eyes glowing red, her mouth twisted into a malicious grin. The oppressive darkness around her seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. She wasn't just a spirit, she was an entity, alive in the sense that she fed on their fear. "You think you can break free?" the witch taunted. "You are nothing. You belong to me now, just as the Bell family did before you." The witch's bargain. Evelyn Lawrence, her face pale and her hands shaking, gathered all her remaining strength. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The Bell Witch's grin widened. "I want nothing but your souls. I have taken the Bell family. Now I will take you." As the witch spoke, the shadows around her seemed to writhe, growing more intense as though the darkness itself was feeding off the terror in the room. The witch's gaze turned to Sarah, the youngest child, whose eyes were wide with fear. "You will never see the light again, little one," the witch said, her voice a hiss. "You are mine." The room grew colder, the light from the fireplace flickering as if it could barely hold on. Sarah, her hands gripping the arm of the chair she sat in, was no longer screaming. She stared blankly, her body slack as if she had already surrendered to the witch's control. But Evelyn, despite the horror, felt a surge of desperate love for her daughter. "No," Evelyn whispered. "We will fight. We will leave." But the witch only laughed, the sound echoing in their ears. "You cannot fight what you do not understand. You have no strength against me. Your souls are already claimed." In that moment, as the family looked around at each other, they realized the terrifying truth. They could never leave. No one could. A desperate choice. Jack, his face pale but determined, looked to Samuel Carter, the historian who had warned them of the witch's return. Carter had tried to help them, offering his expertise on the curse, but he too had fallen victim to its grip. His warnings had come too late. "Is there no way to stop it?" Jack asked desperately, his voice breaking. "Is there anything we can do?" Carter, his face drawn and hollow, stared at the witch in terror. He had seen the Bell Witch's power before, but standing in her presence now, he knew they were too far gone. The witch's control had grown so strong that it seemed to saturate every aspect of their lives, every inch of their existence. There was no escape. And then, as if in response to their desperation, the Bell Witch spoke again, her voice thick with malice. "There is one way, but it will come at a cost." The family froze. What could the witch possibly mean? Was there a way to break the curse after all? "If you wish to leave this place," the witch continued, "if you wish to free yourselves from my grasp, you must offer a sacrifice. One of you must give up their life to me. Only then will I release you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The family stared at each other, torn between fear and the desperate hope of freedom. A life must be given for another to survive. It was a horrific choice, but they had no other option. They had already lost so much. For a long, agonizing moment, no one spoke. Finally, it was Evelyn who spoke first. "I'll do it," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "I'll sacrifice myself to end this." But Jack grabbed her arm, his face frantic. "No, Evelyn. You can't. We'll find another way. We can't give up a life. I won't let you do this." Evelyn looked into his eyes, and for the first time in months, she saw something other than fear in his gaze. She saw the love they had shared, the life they had built. But in that moment, she knew what had to be done. The Bell Witch's curse could not be fought with weapons or prayers. The only way to break the cycle was to offer what the witch wanted most, a soul freely given. "I love you," Evelyn said softly. "But this is the only way. Don't let our children suffer anymore." The final sacrifice. With a deep breath, Evelyn stepped toward the Bell Witch. The witch's glowing eyes followed her every move, and for the first time, Evelyn felt the oppressive grip loosen, if only just slightly. "It's done," the witch whispered, a wicked satisfaction in her voice. Without hesitation, Evelyn closed her eyes and knelt before the witch. As she offered herself as the sacrifice, the witch's form began to shift, a dark mist swirling around her. For the briefest moment, it seemed as if the very air had thickened, the room shaking violently as if the earth itself was protesting. Evelyn's body went still, her heart stilled in the process of giving everything up. Her sacrifice had been accepted. The house, once filled with fear, grew eerily quiet. The oppressive darkness seemed to lift, and for the first time in years, the air felt lighter. As Evelyn's lifeless form slumped to the floor, the Bell Witch's power seemed to dissipate. The shadows that had once loomed in every corner of the house began to recede, fading into the ether. The family, shaken to their core, looked around in disbelief. The witch was gone. For the first time, they were free. But freedom had come at a terrible price. The air around the Lawrence family remained eerily still in the aftermath of Evelyn's sacrifice. The oppressive weight of the Bell Witch's presence, once unbearable, had finally lifted, leaving the house silent in the early morning hours. The faint sound of birdsong could be heard outside, and the sun peeked through the windows, casting long beams of light that felt like a sign of renewal. For a fleeting moment, the family dared to believe they were free. But the peace they had fought so hard for would not last. The Bell Witch's grip on the land had been severed, but the remnants of its curse were far from gone. The land, the house, everything about it felt different now. The Lawrence family, though free from the witch's immediate presence, would soon discover that the darkness was never truly gone. It was merely lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Jack Lawrence, despite the sense of relief that washed over him, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He walked through the house, checking on his children, Sarah and Michael, who had fallen into a quiet sleep after the sacrifice. They seemed untroubled by the events of the past few days, their innocent minds untouched by the horrors they had witnessed. But Jack could feel it, something in the house, in the earth beneath them, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air felt thick again, as if the world had shifted back into a darker, unseen place. Later that night, after tucking the children into bed, Jack and his son Michael went outside to the porch, hoping for some fresh air to clear their minds. But as they stood there in the cool night, they felt a sudden shift, a coldness that seeped into their bones, as if the wind itself had turned icy and sharp. The stillness was broken only by the faint sound of something else, soft, deliberate footsteps in the distance. At first, Jack thought it might be an animal, or perhaps just the wind carrying distant sounds. But when the footsteps grew louder and closer, he knew something was wrong. He turned to Michael, his heart racing. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. Michael nodded, his young face pale. "I hear it, Dad. It sounds like someone's walking, but there's no one there." Jack's blood ran cold. He rushed into the house, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that made the windows rattle. The atmosphere inside was thick and heavy again, suffocating them with the unmistakable presence of something dark and powerful. And then, in the silence, the whispers began. "You thought I was gone." The voice was unmistakable, the Bell Witch's voice, deep and malevolent, echoed through the walls. "But I am always here. You cannot escape." Jack turned to Michael, but the boy's face was frozen, staring wide-eyed at something Jack could not see. He followed his son's gaze to the corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to stretch and shift, pulsating as if it had a life of its own. The air around them grew colder, and Jack's heart raced as he felt the familiar, oppressive presence of the Bell Witch return. The return of the curse. The Lawrence family, after having faced so much, now realized the painful truth: the curse had never truly left. Evelyn's sacrifice had broken the witch's immediate hold on their souls, but it had not ended the curse that had been passed down through generations. The Bell Witch's power was tied to the very land they stood on, and the cycle was far from finished. That night, as Jack stood in the middle of the room, paralyzed by the growing darkness, he heard a faint cry. It was Sarah calling out for help from upstairs. He ran to her room, but when he opened the door, he was met with an empty room. Sarah was gone. In the spot where she had been standing, there was a single, cold handprint on the wall, its fingers stretching unnaturally long. Desperation gripped him. "Sarah," he called, but his voice felt weak against the mounting terror. "You cannot fight me. I am the one who remains," the witch's voice hissed, as if it came from the very walls themselves. Jack and Michael searched the house frantically, but the witch seemed to be everywhere, slipping between the walls, hiding in the shadows. Tom seemed to lose all meaning. Every turn, every corner, felt like they were being led further into a labyrinth with no escape. Then, in the kitchen, they found her. Sarah was sitting in a chair, her back to them, staring into the dimly lit room. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, but they were not her eyes. They were dark, hollow, filled with something far darker than fear. She didn't move when Jack called her name. The silence that hung in the air was suffocating. Then, as if on cue, the shadows around Sarah began to writhe and twist. The air grew colder, and the voice of the Bell Witch filled the room, resonating with power. "She is mine now." Jack rushed to Sarah's side, but the moment he touched her shoulder, the witch's grip tightened. He could feel the coldness invade his body, draining him of strength. He tried to pull Sarah away, but her body was like stone, unyielding. The darkness around them closed in, the witch's power threatening to consume them both. The final confrontation. Jack knew then that the only way to free his family and to end this cycle was to destroy the source. The Bell Witch had lived for centuries, feeding on fear and blood, but it was tied to the land, to the very soil that had birthed the curse. If he was going to end this nightmare, he needed to sever the witch's connection to the land once and for all. With Michael's help, Jack went to the heart of the farm, to the Old Bell farmhouse that had once been the site of so much suffering. The farmhouse was now nothing more than a decaying ruin, but Jack knew what he had to do. He needed to perform a ritual, one that would bind the witch to the earth itself and destroy it forever. With no other choice, Jack and Michael set to work, gathering materials from the remnants of the Old Bell family possessions, ancient tools that had been passed down through generations. They created a circle of salt and symbols drawn in chalk, surrounded by fire. As they began the incantation, the air grew heavy and the ground trembled beneath their feet. But the Bell Witch would not go quietly. The darkness that had surrounded Sarah lashed out at them, causing the air to crackle with energy. The shadows twisted violently and the temperature dropped, but Jack and Michael pressed on. They recited the words they had learned, praying that they had the strength to finish what Evelyn had begun. The moment the ritual reached its peak, a terrifying force erupted from the ground. The witch's voice screamed in fury, the very walls of the farmhouse shaking as if it were alive, fighting to maintain its grip on the land. Then, with one final cry, the Bell Witch's presence was extinguished. The land fell silent, and for the first time in years, the oppressive weight lifted from the farm. The witch was gone, its power broken, its reign of terror over. The lasting silence. The Lawrence family, though scarred by their experience, stood in the now silent farmhouse. The curse had been broken, and the Bell Witch was gone. But the cost had been great. The land was forever changed, and the echoes of the witch's dark power still lingered in the corners of their minds. Jack and his family left the land, never to return. They moved far away, hoping to escape the darkness they had faced. But as they drove away, looking back at the ruins of the Bell farm, they knew they would never truly be free. The Bell Witch's legacy lived on, in the land, in the air, in their memories. And though the Bell Witch had been destroyed, the land that had once been cursed by her power would always carry her mark. The Lawrence family had left the land. They had packed their belongings, said their goodbyes, and moved as far away from the Bell farm as they could. They thought the nightmare was over. The Bell Witch had been defeated, its curse broken, its reign of terror ended. But as they drove away, with the ruins of the Bell farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror, they couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. It wasn't just the memories. It wasn't just the terror they'd endured. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The curse, it seemed, had not been vanquished entirely. It had shifted, morphed, and followed them like an invisible force clinging to their souls. For months after they left the farm, Jack and Evelyn Lawrence tried to rebuild their lives. They tried to find peace, to move on from the horrors of the Bell Witch. But in their new home, strange things began to happen again. It started with small things, objects moved from place to place, footsteps in the hall at night, strange shadows creeping in the corners of their vision. But it wasn't long before the whispers returned. The same eerie, hollow voice that had tormented them on the farm, "You thought you were free?" now haunted their new home. At first, they thought it was a lingering effect of their traumatic experiences, their minds playing tricks on them. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air around them grew cold, and Evelyn began to suffer from nightmares once again. The terror they had faced on the Bell farm seemed to follow them, slipping through cracks in their walls, seeping into their minds. It was as if the Bell Witch had never truly left. But it wasn't until they received a letter that the true horror of their situation became clear. The letter arrived one morning, its envelope old and yellowed with age. There was no return address, no postmark, just a simple piece of parchment inside, covered in strange, archaic writing. It was the kind of writing they'd seen in old journals when they had researched the history of the Bell Witch. The letter read, "The curse cannot be broken. It is bound to the land and to you. You will never be free. The witch lives on, and so shall you." The words were chilling, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the Bell Witch's. Jack and Evelyn's blood ran cold as they realized the terrifying truth. The witch's power had never been contained. The curse had not simply been tied to the land, it had been tied to the Bell family. The land was cursed, yes, but so were they. The Bell Witch had bound herself to their bloodline, and there was no escaping it. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The witch had been a malevolent force from the beginning, but now she was something else entirely, a curse that transcended death, time, and space. The Bell Witch had claimed their souls long ago, and there would be no escape from her grasp. No matter where they went, no matter what they did, the curse would follow them, always. The return of the witch. As the weeks went by, the witch's presence grew stronger. It was no longer confined to the whispers and shadows. The Bell Witch began to appear in the physical world once more, her dark, shadowy form looming in the corners of their house, watching them with glowing red eyes. Her voice, once an unseen torment, now echoed through the walls, speaking directly to them. "You will never escape me." Jack and Evelyn tried everything they could think of, consulting priests, performing exorcisms, even seeking help from the most powerful mediums and spiritualists they could find. But nothing worked. The witch's grip tightened with each failed attempt. The family's hope diminished, replaced with the cold certainty that they were bound to the curse forever. But as the witch grew stronger, so did Jack's resolve. He could no longer live in fear. He couldn't let his children grow up in terror, knowing that they, too, would be marked by this curse. He knew what he had to do. He had to face the Bell Witch once and for all, and this time he would end it. He would destroy the curse, no matter the cost. Jack and Michael went back to the Bell farm, where it had all started and where the witch's power had originated. The house was nothing but a shell, a rotting reminder of the horrors that had taken place there. But the land still pulsed with an unnatural energy. The witch was here, waiting. Armed with everything they had learned during their previous encounters, they set up a final ritual in an attempt to destroy the curse once and for all. The ritual was the most dangerous and powerful spell they could perform, a binding spell meant to sever the witch's connection to their bloodline and end the cycle of torment. As they recited the words, the air around them began to crackle with energy. The ground shook beneath their feet and the wind picked up, howling like a ferocious beast. Shadows danced around them, flickering and shifting in the corners of their vision. And then the Bell Witch appeared once more, her form materializing from the darkness. "You cannot destroy me," she hissed, her voice filled with rage and disbelief. "I am eternal. You cannot break the curse. You are mine." But Jack and Michael pressed on, chanting the final words of the incantation. As they did, the witch's form began to falter, her shape twisting and distorting. The darkness around them thickened, suffocating them, but they pushed through, unwilling to give in. The final words of the spell rang out louder than the witch's voice. And then, in an explosion of light and darkness, the witch vanished. The land fell silent. The aftermath. For a moment, everything was still. The oppressive weight that had plagued the Bell family for generations seemed to lift, as if the land had finally exhaled. The curse was broken. The Bell Witch was no more. Jack and Michael stood together in the ruins of the Bell farmhouse, the land now calm and peaceful. The air was no longer cold, the shadows no longer moving in the corners of their vision. It was as though the land had been freed from the witch's grasp. The silence was deafening, but it was a welcome sound. But even in their relief, they knew the truth. The Bell Witch's influence would never fully be erased from the land, from their bloodline, from their memories. The curse had been broken, but the scars would remain. The Bell Witch's legacy would live on in the stories, in the whispers of the wind, in the land that had once been hers. As Jack and Michael left the farm, they felt the weight of their history lifting. They would live on, free from the witch's grasp, but the echoes of the past would forever be with them. The Bell Witch had finally been vanquished, but its story would never truly end. The curse had lived on for generations, and though it was broken, it would always be remembered.